Hello everyone, and welcome to what I think will be a really special discussion about an important new book. We're really fortunate today to have Dr. Michael Dwyer here to discuss his book, Upland Geopolitics, Postwar Laos and the Global Land Rush, if you can see it here. The event today is co-hosted by the Center for Chinese Research and Center for Southeast Asia Research at the School of Public Policy and Global Affairs here at the University of British Columbia. I'm Jessica DiCarlo, and I'm a geographer and a postdoctoral research fellow in the School of Public Policy and at the Institute of Asian Research. And I'd like to begin by acknowledging that the land on which UBC is situated and where we virtually gather is the traditional, ancestral, and unceded territory of the Musqueam people. It's my pleasure today to introduce author Mike Dwyer, who's an assistant professor of geography at Indiana University, Bloomington. Mike is a political ecologist who studies agrarian change, environmental governance, and infrastructure development in Southeast Asia. He's conducted fieldwork in Laos and Cambodia on social and legal geographies, as well as the policy trade-offs of large-scale land deals, land titling, new road and energy infrastructure, and carbon forestry. So today we're here to discuss his new book, which is on Chinese agribusiness investment in northern Laos. Dr. Dwyer develops a nuanced account of the new global land rush and its connections to longer trajectories of foreign investment in the region, which he argues continue to pave the way for transnational enclosure in a very socially uneven landscape. This book is a significant scholarly achievement, as he draws on 14 years of careful fieldwork, ethnography, and archival data to reveal a story of change on the land with profound implications for understanding state formation and environmental politics. And Mike follows a tradition of studying up, looking at how power works in practice, from provincial authorities in Laos to American Cold War strategists, development bank staff, Chinese policymakers, and the Laos central government. As we're going to hear about a bit today, the book makes theoretical interventions on the politics of transparency, formality, and legibility, and offers new ways to think about the ways that geopolitics plays out on a micro scale. So looking forward, Upland Geopolitics shows us how to approach a world in which land is an ever greater source of conflict and investment. With solutions to climate change and rising extractivism targeting lands of the global south, how much land and whose land is available are highly politically charged questions. And we're going to see some of the tools that Mike gives us to think about those questions moving forward. Turning to the second part of the discussion, we're also really fortunate to have Dr. Juliette Liu joining us today. Juliette is an assistant professor in the Department of Forest Resources Management and the School of Public Policy here at UBC. And I can think of no better person to be in conversation with Mike on this book. She has spent years living between China and Laos, studying China's growing investments in land and resources throughout Southeast Asia. And I know the two of you have had innumerable conversations on these issues. And Mike has been a mentor to both me and Juliette throughout our doctoral research and beyond. He is, in my opinion, truly a model scholar and mentor, so it's a privilege to get to host this discussion after watching his book come to fruition after so many years. Following Dr. Dwyer's talk, Juliette will offer several remarks and pose questions to kick off our Q&A before we open it to a wider audience. Throughout the session, feel free to type questions in the Zoom or just hold them for later, and we can take them in a more kind of discussion format here. And if you'd like to read more, Mike and Juliette recently published a conversation on the book in the new open access journal, Global China Pulse, and I'll add a link to the chat for everyone to read. So now, without further ado, I'll turn it over to Dr. Dwyer. Thank you.
Wonderful. Thanks for such a lovely and extended introduction, Jess. Thanks in advance to Juliette for being here and agreeing to chat about the book after I get through the prepared part of the talk. It's really lovely to see a couple old friends here scattered in the audience, and so it's a pleasure to be able to present something that I'm both trepidatious about putting out there and also proud of, and so I guess that's what books do to you. Let's see, the book, it grows out of you could say a commitment to try to do what, when I was in grad school, was being called global ethnography, and specifically to do it with land. And that's sort of working from the premise that if you look at property in particular, you learn a lot, not just about the place, be it landscape, country, region, whatever, where those property relations are developing and working, but you also learn a lot about the global system because property is inevitably transnational in many, many contexts, and especially in the global South, where a lot of the investment capital comes from abroad. So it's actually a way to study globalization. I'll put up my slides in a second, but I guess if may as well start here since I'll show you the book cover. Can everybody see the slides? Slide. Okay. So you can see the cover of the book here in the lower right. The book sort of grew out of I just said 14 years of certainly engagement, not quite 14 years of field work, but 14 years of coming and going to and from Laos. And I'll give a little bit more detail later in the talk. But initially, it was an effort to go and study Western development and to study land politics related to hydropower. And the more I waited for my research visa to come through, the more I got pulled into a new orbit of Chinese development up in the northwestern part of the country. And so in that sense, the book was the project was always going to be about Laos. It was always going to be about development and geopolitics. But it sort of serendipitously ended up being about China. And in the process, I think it ended up being somewhat of an effort to try to capture some of the changing geopolitics of international cooperation. And so that's, I think, one of the things that Laos can help us think through as a case study. So maybe that would be somewhere that we talk even beyond the specifics of the case when we get into discussion. I generally don't like talks that are read, but because it's a book talk, I'm going to read a couple of passages. And I wanted to start out with one that's actually the opening sketch of the book. And I'm not going to preface it any more than what I've already given, because as you'll see, it helps to be a little bit lost. All right. And oops, I need my, there we go. A large hand-painted sign greets visitors to the rubber tree nursery just outside Viengpuka, a rural district capital in northwestern Laos. Taking up much of the second-story wall of the nursery's main building, its title is long and formal. The land use map of the 3,000-hectare rubber planting promotion project, Viengpuka district of Bolisat Ltd, Yunnan Province, People's Republic of China, end quote. Despite its size and prominent display, however, the map itself is easy to miss. Aside from its thickly painted title, little else is visible. Its thin black lines and faded yellow patches, here you can see a close-up of the cartography itself, blend in with the weathered off-white background. The legend, lightly sketched out in the map's bottom right corner, has yet to be filled in. When my Lao colleagues and I first came across this map in 2007, it was barely legible. This was not simply because it was so hard to read. Even when the image came into view, it was still impossible to read. Maps make sense because they contain symbols that tie or index them to the real world, as David Turnbull points out. This map had no visible indices, at least none that our team, a research delegation from Laos's National Land Management Authority, could make out. The cartography itself gave few visual clues about what the various lines or patches might represent, and no obvious symbols for roads, rivers, villages, or prominent landmarks linked its faintly drawn polygons to the landscape around us. The missing legend didn't help either. It was as if the whole thing had been drawn to announce the project's presence without actually giving away anything about its operations. Our confusion stemmed from the fact that we were seeing this formal geography of rubber plantation promotion for the first time. We were thus limited to the sorts of inquiries reserved for unprepared visitors. What was the project doing? Where was it working and with whom? How far along was it? When would the rubber trees mature? Had we understood the map, we might have asked why the project was targeting agriculturally zoned land for conversion to industrial tree crops, which was a violation of central government food security policy designed to prevent the replacement of food crops by industrial tree plantations. We might also have asked how the project was impacting local landholdings, since, as we would later learn, the project's greatest conversions of food production land to rubber plantations were in the district's poorest and most socially vulnerable villages. Finally, we might have pushed harder to find out exactly what the project planners and local authorities meant by rubber plantation promotion, or song sum, since later we would discover that this term meant different things in different places. These were the questions that mattered. As it was, however, the map confronted us as an inscrutable black box. Unable to open it, we could only ask the polite questions reserved for visitors. So that's how the book starts. And in that sketch, it tries to lay out the two big themes that the book addresses, one of which is the unevenness of the enclosure process that we see if we start zooming in on transnational land deals. And the other is the question of bureaucratic illegibility, or what even states sometimes have trouble identifying as their own land deals. So it frames these two themes. It also frames the central case that's at the heart of the book, which is Chinese rubber planting promotion, much of which took place under a bilateral rubric that Juliet and I have done some research on, even subsequently to me finishing the book, that extended subsidy schemes to Chinese companies who were working in northern Laos and northern Myanmar. And it really then provides a way to enter the conversation around the global land rush more generally, which has been framed as an accelerated process of dispossession that, as Mark Edelman wrote in 2013, is clearly in motion. But the two questions that the book tries to investigate are, what turns a generalized land rush, so a demand for land by countries and corporations and some mix of the two that end up being some version of sovereign wealth and sovereign capital. What turns a general land rush into a land grab in some places, but not in others? And then why don't states like Laos seem to know where their own land grabs are? And this second question emerges from some of the answers to the first, which center on the state's role in creating land access for foreign companies. So if you follow the sort of the arc of these questions, this takes you through the whole book. What I want to do in the talk today is I'll say a little bit more about the project as a whole, and then I'm going to really focus on the two pieces of those questions. The first being the uneven enclosure, which is really, in my particular case, a story of the legacies of Cold War violence in northern Laos. And then the second question, which is the data politics, and which I'll describe in terms of geographies of opacity and legibility. And then I'll wrap up with a couple of thoughts there. So project as a whole tries to make sense of this landscape of large Chinese rubber projects that at the time that I was doing research, this map didn't exist. This was a map that was created by colleagues who were working for the National Land Management Authority. This map was created by a cartographer who I hired, in part using their data and in part using some other data. We can talk about data later, but this is kind of putting the punchline of the end of the story at the beginning, in the sense that there are a number of large Chinese rubber projects that are located around what the book describes as the lower uplands of northern Laos, northwestern Laos. And so these tend to be areas that are under 800 meters in elevation. So it means that they're relatively safe for rubber plantation development. And they also tend to be along some sort of road access. All of this kind of grew out of a much fuzzier geography of transnational land dealing that was exemplified by this map that was published in November of 2008 in The Guardian, which came from some data that was from the NGO Grain, which really helped break open this story of the global land grab or the global land rush in the fall of 2008. And what you saw in some of that early data was very much a methodologically nationalist framing of country X buying land in country Y, and some really unbelievably large numbers. So China owns 700,000 hectares in Laos, kind of thing, where Laos as a whole, I think, is about 24 million hectares. And so big numbers. Even more recently, there's been an effort to try to track some of these land deals over the last really decade plus. And if you, through this project called the Land Matrix, and there's still lots of problems with this data. So it's part of what the book tries to develop is a theory of why the data itself has been so hard to get. That goes beyond, well, it's sensitive, because there are plenty of other instances where sensitive data actually does make its way into the public domain. And so ultimately where the book goes is to try to get inside the politics of resource rent control within the Laos state that goes into the hoarding and influencing of data itself. So I'll get toward that in the later part of the project, in the later part of the talk. Most of my field work was done in 2006, 7, and 8. I did a little bit of preliminary work before that. I did some follow-ups. The present tense of the book is essentially written in 2018 from the perspective of some follow-up research that I did in that year. But most of it then is written in sort of the past tense, covering this period of fieldwork in 2006, 7, and 8. My access to the landscapes that I'll be talking to you more about was largely facilitated by working with the National Land Management Authority of Laos, which at the time was sort of a nascent regulator that had been created in 2005 to try to get a handle on some of the land allocation that provincial and district governors were doing all over the country, and the stories and rumors of which were starting to trickle their way into the capital of Vientiane, but crucially not the documents or the maps. And so the working with some of these folks both took me to the field, as well as gave me access to what I call the regulatory milieu around land policy in the national capital, which ended up being a really important field site for me as well, even though initially it just sort of felt like a home base. The project itself ended up focusing on this area that you can see in the squiggly black-yellow line in northwestern Laos. That's a road corridor that was developed in 2004, 5, 6, 7 or so, and paved. It's an old caravan trade route that runs between southern China and northern Thailand. And it was essentially reimagined by the Asian Development Bank and the member countries of the so-called Greater Mekong subregion, including Laos, in the 90s. And it was then operationalized as a new highway corridor in the early 2000s. If we zoom in on this area, this is kind of what it looked like when I started going to the field in 2005. And over the course of my field work, it was the road itself was paved. It ended up looking like this as I was leaving the field. It's now sort of a rapid through road between Thailand and China. But pretty crucially, it created a land rush into the land corridor that surrounds the road, even going out a couple of kilometers. And that really opened up space for both transnational and domestic land deals. And so there was kind of a land rush that was seen by some of the planners of this road corridor, but not fully mitigated. The project went through a kind of intermediate stage as a dissertation in 2010-11, and then was updated in the last, say, 5 years or so, and it just came out in the fall in September. The area that I'm going to be focusing on here is this whole district of Vieng Phu Ka. And just to show you a little corner of Vieng Phu Ka, that's actually not the main focus of the talk, but one of the enabling conditions in addition to this road was the kinds of mitigation that were happening along with the Asian Development Bank's loans were such that they were limited to tens of meters next to the roadside corridor. And so they did essentially a form of proactive land titling, but only in the narrowest band. And it's really all this land outside that was not really considered for mitigation that ended up as part of the land rush. So my book really takes a dive through both present and past using interviews and ethnographic work and documents from the present day. It starts out in the present day. I prepared this slide a couple of weeks ago for a methods talk I gave, but I thought it was a nice way to talk a little bit about the arc of the book. So it talks about the present land rush at the beginning, and then it goes back in time and has essentially a Cold War chapter before 1975 in chapter 2, and then another Cold War chapter in the late Cold War, 1975 to 90 or so in chapter 3, before it then puts that stuff all together to zoom in on some of these landscapes from both a perspective of dispossession, which is kind of the big theme of chapter 4, and then legal geographies, which is chapter 5. So the stories I'm going to tell today. The main first part is going to span chapter 1 and chapter 4, but really mostly be about that detailed, historically referenced land grab and land rush that happened in Vientiane district, and then the bureaucratic, the data politics stuff is chapter 5. So that just captures what I'm going to talk about a little bit. So let me get into this first piece of the story. It really centers on this area that in the book I describe as an area that's called Ket Nam Pha. This is where some of the big enclosures took place. And oh, sorry, I knew I had forgotten something. And as a way to segue into this first part of the talk, I wanted to move from this sort of general road corridor that I was showing you before to the specifics. And so I'm going to read just a short passage from the end of chapter 1 that then bridges into the zoomed in case that I'm going to get into in more detail. Of all the places where rubber cooperation was promoted by Chinese companies and local Lao authorities, only some communities lost land. The socially uneven distribution of enclosure and dispossession has been noted throughout Laos's concession boom, as well as more widely throughout the global land rush. In Laos, it jibes with a long-standing recognition that land policy is subject to differing interpretations by local authorities, often due to how it connects with various local interests and power struggles. While this can have some positive implications in some cases, it also clearly has negative ones in circumstances like the ones that I discuss. In contexts like the Northern Economic Corridor's upland villages, where property formalization was still in flux, and where the promotion of rubber was often paired with a strong dose of coercion to accept any development assistance on offer, negotiations with investors and government officials demand both political acumen and active citizenship. The lack of spatial detail about where and how Chinese rubber schemes operated leaves unanswered questions about how land's social availability was negotiated on the ground and how this differed from place to place. We need to look carefully at the historical terrain on which citizenship is created and negotiated if we are to make sense of the uneven enclosures that are exemplified by this area of Ket Nam Pha, which is where the big land grabs took place. While mainland Southeast Asia's economic integration has famously been called turning battlefields into marketplaces, this was a phrase that was used to promote transnational cooperation by the Thai prime minister in, I think, 1988, 89, right at the end of the Cold War. This phrase is usually interpreted both regionally and metaphorically by both critics and proponents. Instead, we need to take this phrase more literally by examining Southeast Asia, not just as a Cold War landscape in a general sense, but also as an interlinked network of actual local landscapes where Cold War conflict took place on the ground and where place-specific struggles over land access continue today. It is in these groundings that we see how the slippages from a regulatory pushback that was initially promoted in Northern Laos against giving large-scale land concessions to Chinese companies became slipped into a quasi-concession mode of large land deals like the one pictured on the screen here. Examining the global land rush in the landscapes and communities of northwestern Laos thus illustrates not just the mechanics of land grabbing, but also shows the ways in which legacies of geopolitical conflict can linger on the ground, animating the micropolitics of land access far longer than they have any right to. So that's the transition from this sort of opening sketch about the opening chapter of what's going on now into the historical milieu of Northern Laos. And to see this, we have to go back in time. So in contrast to the maps that I've shown that where you see land deals and road corridors, I want to go back to this 1972 map that comes from a RAND report that was authored by a guy named Douglas Blaufarb, who got to be famous in Cold War circles in the US as a theorist of counterinsurgency, which in part drew on his work as the CIA station chief in Laos from 1960 to 64, I believe, in the early 60s sometime. And when he was done doing that, he was then hired by RAND in 1972 to essentially do a very sort of cold, calculated economic analysis and political analysis of what went wrong and what went right in Laos at a moment when the US was losing the Vietnam War, and the defeat in both Laos and Cambodia and Vietnam was very much on the horizon, but was not yet quite a done deal. And in order to, if we go back to that period, we see the northwest of Laos not as this regionally integrated corridor space, but as totally unroaded, as probably the most remote part of a remote country. If you read descriptions of Laos at that time, it was, as a whole, often conjured as this sort of isolated space between Vietnam and Thailand. And this was nowhere more so than up in the northwest. This is a historical photo of President Kennedy doing a briefing in 1962 about the Laotian crisis. Similarly, you sort of see the main roads in the country as going from the capital to the northern old royal capital of Luang Prabang, and then going east to the Vietnamese border. There's absolutely nothing in the northwest. And I wanted to read a passage from Lafargue's report from 1972, where he described Laos as hardly a country except in the legal sense. He wrote that history and terrain have divided the land into separate regions with little to bind these together. The population is a mixture of races and religions, of primitive hill tribes and lowland paddy-growing Lao peasants who regard each other with fear and hostility. Although in control of the government and its military forces, the ethnic Lao comprise less than half the population. The elite of this Lao minority is a collection of rival clans who share little in the sense of national purpose, but regard the government and the public service as an arena where they compete for influence and power to enrich themselves. The country as a whole is underdeveloped in every way. A limited road network connects the main towns along the Mekong River, but with few exceptions, avoid the hinterlands, a rugged roadless expanse of jungled hills and limestone ridges. So this is, for anybody who's sort of followed development rhetoric, this kind of thing is still disturbingly common in present day development rhetoric in terms of talking about cronyism and elite and the lack of a national esprit de corps, talking about Laos as a tribal space and anything but a real country. In the book, I point that out, but I also go into some pretty more detailed discussion of the specific ways that US intervention that was premised on those ideas that Laos wasn't really a real country sought to exploit the terrain and the remoteness and the lack of nationness through its interventions in Laos from 1962 to 1972. And this means going into the history of the Secret War, which if you know anything about Laos or the Vietnam War, usually focuses on an area that you can see on this map as that's called the Plain of Jars, and this is the areas of northeast Laos that were essentially the gateway to Vietnam, where a lot of the bombing and the fighting took place. But the Northwest actually played a really interesting, although important but secondary role in the whole conflict, in that it was the gateway to China, and it was the place where, if US escalation was going to draw a military response from China, it was the place where that response would be first seen. And so the northwest portion of Laos, for most of the Secret War in Vietnam, the Secret War and the Vietnam War, was not actually bombed, but it was very much a Cold War space. And so to see that, I'm going to zoom in on these two rectangles in the next couple of slides, because this is really where the history of US intervention created some of the local dynamics in terms of access to land and the right to resettle or not resettle, depending on which side you were on in the war, that then really shaped property rights even into the 90s and 2000s. And in ways that really manifest in the kinds of rubber deals that I was then looking at. So I was lucky enough to benefit from both some really obvious archival sources, but even more so from some great secondary research. This is a book from this is a map from Al McCoy's book, The Politics of Heroin. McCoy was really a pioneer spending time in this part of the world in the late 60s. And he essentially broke open the story on what the CIA was doing via a base in northwestern Laos that was created in 1962 at a place called Nam Nhu, that ran airborne operations using basically unofficial military pilots and third-party militias, many of which were drawn from local Lao upland communities, to run spying operations into the borderlands of China and Burma. And it specifically used members of ethnic groups that could plausibly be found on any sides of this the four border area, but especially who could be plausibly found in China, Burma, or Laos, in case they were caught. Because this was, as Blaufard puts it, a rather complex organization designed to avoid outright conflict with the Geneva Accords of 1962, which had legally demilitarized or neutralized Laos. So the CIA was doing all this stuff. It did what they called sheep dipping of its officers so that they were civilian contractors, and it used militias that were not actually officially military. It was flaunting the letter of the law while allegedly sticking on the right side of it. And so this area, if you see this area in Nam Nhu, actually it ended up as a pretty important piece of my field work. I was never allowed to go there, and it was actually located in the neighboring province of Bokeo. So it's this area that's down here labeled LS-118A. This is an old military map that was made by the US pilots who were supporting this operation during the 60s and early 70s. It was updated a handful of times, and they kept building more of these landing sites for these small planes to take off and land at. But what I've done here is I've overlaid this shadow of this rubber project that I'll talk more about in a couple of minutes, but that if you're cartographically minded, you might recognize from the opening sketch of the map that was hard to read. I've overlaid this on this landscape, and it's just a couple tens of kilometers to the east of Nam Nhu, but it also overlays itself a bunch of the other old landing sites. And even more importantly, it overlays a bunch of village locations that were villages that were called Ban Meo Nua, Kas Kuis, Ban Mu Se, Ban Ka. These are all old village locations that no longer exist, and that were essentially resettled out of existence in the conflicts of the 70s or the 80s. It was pretty impossible for me to reconstruct this sort of old resettlement history. But what I was doing to try to make sense of the rubber projects was to take the places where land enclosure was happening and to trace the resettlement histories of those communities back as far as I could. And that led me to this figure, which is from the book, which is essentially a story of two very different sets of resettlement that produce the kinds of intense enclosures of Ket Nam Pha that I showed you pictures of before, where the following happened. So on the one hand, communities that were located out, that had previously been living out on this frontier area, so essentially between Nam Nhu and the road corridor now, were forcibly resettled and rounded up through a bunch of different government efforts spanning the 80s and 90s. Some of them were successful, some of them were less successful, and communities then left again. But there was sort of a sustained effort to move people who were seen as being on the wrong side of the war, and some of whom were characterized as ongoing insurgents into these areas that were closer to the district capital and closer to the road that was built later, while at the same time inviting resettlers from this area on the east side of the Nam Ta River, in the area that you can see is now Nale district, to come and resettle some of those same sites. And it's a sort of very explicitly politically driven resettlement of the kind that Andrew Hardy has described for post-conflict Vietnam, but that I hadn't really seen described for Laos as well. The literature on resettlement in Laos was very clear about people from upland communities and remote areas being moved out of the uplands and into the lowlands and into roadside corridors through a process called focal site development. But what was missing from that story was the fact that these remote areas were also being occupied. They were just being given preferentially to communities who essentially had high degrees of political capital while the communities that had lower degrees of political capital were being resettled out. And if you look at these different histories, they also correspond pretty tightly to the winners and losers of these rubber schemes, of this particular rubber scheme that came in the sense that this scheme was very sort of strategically framed as a contract farming project for most of the villages that were participating in it. But then in a couple of villages, that rhetoric of contract farming gave way to something that was much more like a concession. And I'm happy to go into details in the discussion if we need to, but it uses a bunch of terminology that's sort of very specific to Lao agribusiness policy that I find actually more distracting than helpful. But to simply say that the rhetoric mattered, and that this project was framed as a mostly contract farming project, and nowhere more so than in the community that lived in this large village on the frontier called Bandang, who were offered to participate and offered rubber seedlings by the company, but didn't really lose any land. And you really had to go into the roadside areas around Ket Nam Pha to find the large enclosures. So essentially, the first part of the story of the book integrates this uneven enclosure process that was evident to me through this project with the earlier histories of resettlement, which themselves came out of the essentially uneven citizenship of the wartime and then the post-war period. This then raised the question to me of, okay, I was spending time with the National Land Management Authority, and why was it that the data that even they had was so bad and was nowhere near able to find out where the enclosures were happening on a village scale? And so this brings me back to this map that I showed you in the opening sketch. And this, if the first part of the story in terms of telling the story of the uneven enclosures required essentially getting underneath this map, and you can't see where the enclosures are happening even once you figure out what this map shows, I still, the more I spent time with the maps and the data, needed to tell the story of what the maps themselves were doing, even if they weren't telling how the enclosure was happening. And so that led me to a second piece of the project, which is what I cover in chapter 5 of the book, which is essentially, you could say it's a legal genealogy of the spatial data, but it's also a story of how the different government agencies that control this data fight over it and why they do that. So when in the opening sketch I read you, my colleagues and I were essentially encountering this scrappy version of the map in the field. We later found this version, which was the real version that it had been based on, but we hadn't seen this yet. This then got us into the map archive of the local district government and helped us see where and how a bunch of different rubber companies were essentially negotiating for land in different parts of the district. That led me to tell the story in more detail about the various land finding efforts of different Chinese companies. And this led to the map that you see here. And the punchline of this map is that really only the company at the top, the Bolisat Ltd, ended up getting land. The other two companies were targeting these villages down below, but they were essentially pushing too hard for concession lands. And so it really ended up being just this cluster at the top that you can see here in the survey map at the bottom of this figure, ended up being produced and helping to legally create some conditions for making this project happen. So part of what I do in the last chapter of the book is to try to figure out where the maps that create this map come from. And this actually means going back to a series of zoning maps that were created in the late 90s and early 2000s. Lots of trying to follow the paper trails, a lot of dead ends, but this really led to a two-part story. On the one hand, it led to a story of the district government hoarding these maps and not passing them upward to even the provincial authorities, let alone the central government authorities in terms of talking about how much land was being given to which companies and where. So this was really a story of it's the opacity part of the opacity and legibility story. But then the maps itself were creating a new kind of transnational legibility with respect to the Chinese government's opium poppy replacement fund that I mentioned briefly and that I showed you the sign about before, and that I'll come back to in a minute here. And this brings me to the last passage that I wanted to read from the book. And this is from chapter 5. Land deals leave extensive paper trails. While deals vary by case, the rubber projects I studied exemplified the back and forth between processes involving various state authorities and multiple possible field locations that plantation developers traverse as they go through the land finding process. Maps like the ones shown above, so on this figure, sit atop piles of project proposals, letters of introduction, memoranda of understanding, meeting minutes, and one-sided agreements from district governors that show the backing of provincial and district authorities, to name just a few of the documents involved. Yet, despite all of these documents, much of the detail of the about the land access they have facilitated has remained illegible to central level authorities. One of my colleagues from the National Land Management Authority once joked, in reflecting on his experience collecting land deal information from provincial and district authorities, that despite his agency's mandate to coordinate between various ministries and administrative levels on issues of land governance, it was policy not to share the documents between agencies. Often this is framed even by local government staff themselves in terms of low capacity, both in terms of making maps and in terms of caring for them. My colleagues and I encountered this kind of dissembling in 2008 in the lead up to viewing the catch of maps that included Vieng Phuca's original land and forest allocation maps. These are the maps that are shown in the central part and top parts of this figure, as well as the Bolisat Ltd survey map, which you can see at the bottom, and a handful of others that were essentially covering up logging projects that the district had been undertaking, that the district had actually recently updated. We were told that the maps were a mess, and it was only with obvious reluctance that we were eventually allowed to see them. Practically speaking, the maps were a bit of a mess, but this was not the only reason why local authorities were reluctant to share them. And then that the reluctance to share them had to do with the access to the timber rents that were covered in the logging maps, as well as just the power to extract taxes from companies like Bolisat Ltd, whether it's done on the basis of land or plantation size or all these things. And this is still very much an arena of struggle between the companies and local authorities, as well as among the government agencies involved. Nevertheless, and this is the second part of that story though, the Bolisat Ltd map, which is what you see here at the bottom, did create an important type of legibility, albeit of a different and expressly transnational sort. As noted in earlier chapters, and as I described earlier, projects like Bolisat Ltd's were in part financed by Chinese government subsidies that, in their stated purpose to replace opium poppy cultivation with legal agricultural crops, articulated with and grounded the Northern Economic Corridor's wider vision as a licit, not illicit, integrated and development-oriented transformation of the former borderlands of the Golden Triangle. The poppy replacement subsidies were generous, offering reimbursement for 80 to 90% of exploration and insurance costs, as well as cash payments of up to 25 to 70 US dollars per hectare developed, depending on the crop. To access these payments, however, companies were required to provide evidence of feasibility and permission, such as contracts, official letters and MOUs, feasibility studies, and yes, maps. Even if it did not show the location of Bolisat Ltd's actual plantations. So these sketches, these hashed areas showed the areas within which the plantations were supposed to be developed. So they didn't actually show the plantations themselves, but this was the district government trying to keep the company's rubber plantations out of the forest areas. So even if it didn't show exactly where the plantations were going to be developed, the map effectively said that from the district government's perspective, providing 3,000 hectares of local land to the company would not be a problem. Maps are pictures, and this is the last bit that I'll read from the book. Maps are pictures that travel, immutable mobiles in the language of Bruno Latour. But while this traveling can be a source of power when accurate knowledge is carried across distance, in Latour's classic example, this concerns naval supremacy because one side has the foreknowledge of an area thanks to a good map. The mobility can also be, the mobility can be more important than the immutability. As critical cartographers have shown, the power of maps is not merely to carry realistic representations to faraway places, but to carry ideas and claims, whatever their relationship to reality. Nicholas Rose, for example, describes maps as little machines for producing convictions in others. And indeed, the less the viewer knows about the area being shown, the more easily their conviction can be manipulated. Maps like Bolisat LTDs would have run into problems if they had been taken too literally, and it should be no surprise that the land acquisition process itself relied on other means. So that was the whole Cold War legacy story. But farther away, the map would have worked like a charm, since a combination of unfamiliarity with the terrain and an interest in supporting new Chinese agribusiness made the map's potential audience unlikely to object. Like the signs that advertise Chinese poppy replacement development projects across northern Laos more generally, the map would have functioned much like it did in my initial encounter to signify approval without getting into the details. So that the book sort of, as it goes through this legal geography, it sort of comes full circle into saying that this illegible maps that you see in public are actually not that different from these signs that say, hey, there's development going on here, but there's nothing, we're not going to tell you anything more. And you really have to go into somewhat into the documents and into the villages really themselves in order to see what's going on, where and why. So this brings me to the end. And so the story that is really underneath the case. So the book itself essentially takes, if any of you are familiar with Doreen Massey's global, what she calls a global sense of place, she thinks of places as meeting points in space and time for global processes. Essentially, that's what the book does through a single land deal. And it takes numerous detours through Cold War history, colonial forestry, post-75 upland management of natural resources, ongoing state formation, Chinese development going abroad, legal geography, land administration, all that stuff to sort of think about and theorize land deals and property in particular as this complex set of social relations. And if the story that I told itself sort of hinges on a very particular Cold War story, I think more generally it's worth thinking about the ways that property and citizenship interact with each other in the context of the new global land rush. I was really sort of inspired through thinking through my data by some scholars who've worked in West Africa. And so this is people like Christian Lund, as well as, I'm blanking on the name right now, but people who've really sort of looked to the social relations of property that are located off the map to try to explain why enclosures happen really where they do. Secondly, I think one of the implications is that not only do we have an explanation about why some of the numbers remain so bad, but it really points toward this process of formality and mapping and land administration as a potential arena of struggle, both locally and also transnationally when it comes to enclosure and related processes more broadly. And one of the things that this got me thinking about was, even if it would have been sort of difficult to challenge some of the enclosures in this particular process, what if the kinds of proactive land rush mitigation efforts linked to that road corridor had actually been a little bit broader in terms of their efforts to protect local communities? And those are the kinds of things that NGOs have been targeting for a long time. And so I think there's a truly global process or truly global politics that points to some of these formalization of things like project impact area that provide some potential threads to pull for folks among us who are a little bit more advocacy minded. And then third is this question that or this theme that I've been tripping over repeatedly of post-neoliberalism or what post-neoliberal development might look like, in the sense that this is sometimes talked about as a more hopeful term, given that the lessons of neoliberalism have been learned. Having seen what development looks like with a more sort of authoritarian and stronger hand of the state that's explicitly involved, I have a little bit of a darker take on what post-neoliberalism has meant so far in practice. But I also am attuned to the continuing rhetoric of social equality that underlies, in particular, some of the Chinese development cooperation rhetoric. And I think that rhetoric can be also a political opening for various kinds of conversations and transnational advocacies as well. So I wonder if it's there's no easy answer to any of this stuff, but just in terms of thinking about now that the state is more explicitly involved in many development interventions, what kinds of openings that creates. So a couple of quick thanks to the UBC SPPGA, the departments and programs that you all are part of, to Jess and Juliet in particular, just to flag that there's an open access version of the book that's out there. You can use this link, or you can just Google it, and it's pretty easy to find. But it's been financed by a program called TOME, or Toward an Open Access Ecosystem, toward an Open Access Monograph Ecosystem, that with funds from IU. And then to my colleagues Phil Hirsch, Kevin Woods, and Natalia Skura, with whom I co-edited a book that does a similarly sort of historical and regional take on the land rush, but tries to do it for the Mekong region as a whole rather than for northwestern Laos in particular. But these are essentially sister projects, and this also came out last year from UW Press. So that's the end. Thanks to you all for your patience, and let's chat.
Great. Thanks so much, Mike, for that incredible talk and incredible details. I am halfway through the book, so I feel like I cheated a little bit getting to hear this from you first before I finished it all. But I already have questions burning, as I'm sure the audience does. But first, let's turn to Juliet for comments and any questions she has to kind of kick off the Q&A. Juliet?
Hi, everyone. So I wanted to give context as to like who Mike is for my work, and for a lot of people who work in Laos. And I give that context partly because the only question I kind of want to land on is about the importance of Laos for kind of global, like Mike opened with this idea of global ethnography, but yeah, I have an ending question about the significance of the case of Laos when we think about so I want to talk a little bit about the tensions between specificity and complexity, versus like the push, I think, in our world today for, I think, a really good push to make our results and thought processes, make them transfer to other places so that we can build solidarity across contexts. That's one side, I think, of the push to like take the specificity of the way we do research and make it broad, make it connected, make it generalizable. I think that's a good kind of project and helps us usually to make our research findings more honest and rich and interesting. But also the opposite direction in which the world has been pushed to simplify in ways that condense power and help power be grabbed, in the ways that I think the land grab, that land politics is a terrain where this question of simplicity versus complexity is a very, very, it's a very charged one, and it's important to watch. And so I think my connection to Mike and then Jess's is similar, is that I met Mike Dwyer when I was not yet in the academics, but was working as like a research assistant. I just wanted to like run around doing field work with people. I helped translate a lot from English to Chinese, and I helped like just do English editing. Anyways, Mike was a person that helped me transition to in academic life, like helped me actually read all my essays for applying to grad school. And the most important moment I think that I shared with Mike was calling him desperately from like a shack in the middle of northern Laos, being like, I'm doing my first interview tomorrow. What do I do? What's your advice? Like, I hadn't thought about leading an interview, and Mike's advice was not to rush, to let people talk and get comfortable with silence. And I think that kind of he's an advocate of slow science, an advocate of letting data, really complex data, speak to you and not forcing it into things, forcing it into your original kind of hypotheses and research questions. And he's someone that I think that means that when he does research in Laos, he's really looking at huge amounts of complexity and sits there and lets it slowly kind of unfold for him. It also was a good reminder as an American, especially from the Northeast, who tends to like dive into conversations and strangle interesting things out of people, that really doesn't work in Laos, and it doesn't work in general for finding out more interesting things about, especially when it comes to the topic of land. So I think the way that translates into what I think his work is talking about is that, you know, when you get into, when you look at where Laos was at in the global land grab, and this is, we're going back about a decade and a half to a moment when, you know, in the 1990s, there was a big push to title land. There was a push to make land legible and formalize land, because it was thought that that would help individual land makers hold on to land and avoid disposition. And it was also supposed to help long-term planning around land. And it pushed for simplification. We also had a bunch of technological advances that allowed us to map land really fast. And so all of this pushed the people who were thinking about land from everywhere from the World Bank to individual investors on the border of China and Laos into thinking that now we'd made all these strides, that land was as simple as all the simplifications that geographers talk about. So like, it's just a map, it's an open space, it's something we just can divide up and manage very rationally. And I think what Mike's work does in a lot of ways is help remind us that illegibility and unevenness are things that sound really abstract, but when you play them out at the individual, at the level of the actual plot and the actual kind of place where investment is happening, there are things that are powerful actors and actors on the land are struggling over. And so when he talks about, I think, unevenness, bureaucratic illegibility, showing us how those are purposeful and how those, you know, it's interesting how it translates back and forth. It translates into the development realm, and people, practitioners or land users themselves who are sitting there asking, why was my village chosen for investment? How can I push back against that? Which actor is responsible for choosing my village for development? And that those questions were being asked on a very practical level. And then, you know, when you get into this book and how it talks about illegibility and unevenness, that's something that answers a lot of those questions in a ways that helped people, I think, on the ground actually figure out how to work advocacy, even though they're also kind of helping people think about land on a global scale, think about, well, what are we doing when we're mapping this? And, you know, what are we doing when we count overall number of hectares grabbed, quote unquote, and what are the politics of that? And so what I wanted to bring into the conversation is a reminder that, yeah, it's interesting the way Mike's methods unfold. What he said about global ethnography is interesting because it takes a lot of time to do that kind of work. And it takes, it's difficult to tease apart who has agency. Is it the local people? Is it the local bureaucrats? And in many ways, carrying the idea of unevenness up until all the way up into the kind of way that he pitches his book is something hard, because we don't have a lot of tolerance for complexity when we get to the larger scales, when we're promoting the messages of research at across beyond. And so, Mike, what I wanted to invite you to reflect upon is, you know, you say at the end of the introduction that you comment that especially at a moment when the American empire's more recent forays, you reference Iraq and Afghanistan, they seem to be on the wane. there's a longer term perspective that's offered by the case of Laos that has potentially wide reaching applications. And when I think about this comment that you say Laos is important for broader questions, it's not only interesting that you bring the Cold War questions into a story about Chinese investment, but also that, you mentioned at the beginning of your talk, changing geopolitics of international cooperation. Why is Laos? So I'm wondering, why is Laos such a telling case of broader trends? And if there are struggles that you have communicating and speaking especially about the findings in your research, when you I know you talk a lot to policymakers in Laos. Do you speak differently to them versus when you speak to international development actors, versus when you speak to academics or policymakers at a global scale? So those are my questions and maybe context that I thought maybe would be helpful for the audience. But I'm grateful for this book and the ways that it challenged me to accept complexity and reminded me of the value of that complexity when studying a sector like land where simplification has been pushed for a couple of decades in ways that we forget. It's become so normal that we forget about it as a force of framing. Thanks a lot.
Wow, thanks for the comments. Wow. Yeah, you asked some doozies. How do I talk to people about this book? I am figuring that out right now. It came out, I've been talking to people in Laos about the content of the book for years, but I haven't really, I definitely haven't done book talks in Laos. I got to go back to Laos very briefly in July last year, about 3 weeks before I physically had a copy of the book in my hand. So I've not been able to take the book there. And even with the PDF version, I haven't done a huge amount of publicity yet. And I've been, on the one hand, kind of unsure about how to do that. And then on the other hand, allowing my almost 2-year-old and 2-class teaching load of last semester to be a convenient excuse for why I hadn't done it yet. But I'm trying to figure that out right now. And in particular, I'm trying to move on that this semester. I think one of the ways that I want to go with that is in ways that really challenge the issue of agency that you brought up in terms of there's some bad stuff that's going on in these land deals, and who should we blame, right? I'm really trying to decenter that question because there is decision-making that's involved from the district, you could say the district forestry officials, who are probably the most sympathetic people that I ran across in my research in terms of actually caring about those communities. But they have some decision-making agency all the way on up to the provincial level, to national level, to Chinese central government, provincial government, companies, as well as part of telling the long historical story is to try to say that there are some social fractures here that are being exploited by both people who are being opportunistic, but also people who are in some pretty tough situations in terms of trying to navigate between multiple bad choices. And in terms of pointing toward Iraq and Afghanistan, I think one of the parallels, I think if you sort of look at the whole secret war apparatus, people have written about this already, but Laos basically created the model for what we then did in Afghanistan in the 80s and into the 90s, let alone post 2001. But I think the fact that we're seeing 30 to 40-year legacy stories in terms of suspicion that can still be exploited in terms of creating land grabs in places that don't have bureaucratic modes of property should be a cautionary tale, not only in terms of making the US and American present day policymakers feel bad or try to be accountable for past actions, but also for other international actors, including Chinese companies, who are likely to get burned if they just sort of trust local officials to say, well, this is where the land is. And you've written about, the whole Great Expectations process is a great example of how you can't always believe what the local authorities tell you in terms of where the available land is. But I think there's a cautionary tale in here for development practitioners who should be asking more critically, hey, why are we being directed over here? And what are the implications of working in this one area and working in this as opposed to working in the other area? And the more I've spoken to development practitioners over the years, the more I hear, oh yeah, this is everywhere. Whether we're talking about Central Laos, where the sort of the Cold War history is especially thick, or in the South, for lots of different and not more complex, but complex in different ways reasons. So I think when I think about audiences for this book, the book is written as an academic book. It's an academic monograph. It's an academic press in essentially an environmental and anthropology, environmental studies and anthropology series. It's not written as a policy brief for development practitioners. Some of the messages in the book, I think, are intended for practitioners, but I don't really expect them to sit down with the book as they would with a policy brief. But I'm trying to use the experience of writing the book and having the platform to do that, to engage with policy with development practitioners in ways that would maybe push them to be a little bit more critical about where they work. Does that get at some of the? I think the question of why Laos is a challenging one as well. And I mean, partly you hear people say, well, it's China's neighbor, so they have to sort of do development right to build, support, geopolitical support in the region. There's I don't know. I think Laos is useful in the sense that it, for whatever reasons, and probably for multiple reasons, it has been a hotspot for Chinese aid and development cooperation early on. Is it representative? Maybe not, for a couple of different reasons. But when I think of terms of its utility as a case, I often go back to James Ferguson's Anti-Politics Machine, where he talks about the ways in which thinking about Lesotho as potentially an exaggerated case that actually makes things that are happening more generally, but more visible because it's happening in such sort of exaggerated ways. So I don't have a good answer but I don't necessarily think that representativeness is the ways, but I think the case of Laos is good for throwing out questions about what are the social relations of property off the map and outside the land titling areas, and why does essentially the second project that this book spun off was then to go and follow land titling projects to ask why do you work where you do, given that you're not working where the land grabs are happening.
Yeah, and I like that. Laos is an extreme in some ways because it's so small that people use the most vagrant simplifications when they're talking about it, and so it also makes it easy to disprove them because they're always simplifications, and then they just get placed onto Laos as like, I think this example. I didn't really know those connections to Afghanistan before, which is really fascinating. And I think it's like you can read into global powerful actors, read so much into small places like Laos because they lack understanding, and it exaggerates the mistakes made, I think, with those assumptions.
Yeah, I think most recently Joshua Kurlantic wrote a book called A Fine Place for a War that's about Laos and how it set the model for the sort of JSOC Black Ops stuff that has been really embraced and scaled up since the Obama administration. But Mahmoud Mamdani has written a more academic book called Good Muslim, Bad Muslim that sort of initially turned me onto this stuff. Steve Call's early work on Afghanistan and Ghost Wars. There's a lot of scary parallels that unfortunately I think we're going to see some of these legacy suspicion stories playing out. And I think this is also one of the reasons that the US scrambled so hard to try to get its people out of Afghanistan in just last year. I didn't follow it super closely, but from what I heard, we didn't do a great job. But this is one of the reasons that it was so important, is because people saw this on the horizon.
Right. Interesting.
Well, I suppose we have the last 15 minutes and we can open it up for questions from those in the audience. I'd say since we are a small group and we have our cameras on, if you wouldn't mind just saying your question, feel free to type it if you'd prefer to, but if you're open to just kind of joining the conversation, the floor is open. I think it was oh, go on, Tyler.
Oh, sorry, Jess, if I interrupted you.
Not at all.
I'm still thinking about this question in my head. First, Mike, it was so great to attend the talk, hear about the whole book. I've looked up to your work for a really long time, and I should say that in this forum, but hopefully I've said that to you a few times too.
You have, but I should also thank you. I should thank you because you co-edited the political geography special issue that really helped me develop that road corridor story. So
that was a great project.
Your hand is in the book.
All right, that's great to know. Well,
yeah.
Okay, so then I'll ask a half-formulated question here. So I'm less familiar with the global land rush and grab in the agricultural sector than actually with what it seems folks are using a similar terminology to talk about the global rush for land-based energy systems, i.e. renewable energy. But also, I mean, we could include hydropower and mega projects in this too, in Laos. So I'm wondering, and this is where I haven't quite thought out the full question, but do you see a potential for similar processes that you've documented in your work to take place as more and more of these systems are deployed, even in places like Laos, as they have been in Western China and right across the border in Yunnan? What might be different about a potential global land rush for renewable energy systems, or let's just be broader and say for clean energy materials as well, so mining facilities too. And is it similar? Is it different? Is this something you've been thinking about at all as this sort of takes shape? Maybe I'll just leave the question there, otherwise I'll keep rambling.
No, that's a great question. I haven't thought about the sort of like political ecology take of how does the materiality, the resource shape differences, but I think that there's a huge potential for the same kinds of conjurings of somewhere between empty land and available land that we saw for agricultural and plantation deals to be applied certainly to mining and almost certainly to solar and wind resources as well. Mining and wind in particular being the kinds of resources that the developers will tell you, well, this can only happen here, right? We need this land, as opposed to solar is a little bit more forgiving there. But I think anything that gets a green spin, and whether that's legitimation only or often subsidies, you kind of have to be out on the lookout for, because that also creates additional pressure for communities to like give their land and participate. And so this is why in the book I wrote that it really takes very active citizenship to say no to some of that stuff, or to get involved with it on terms that are positive. And so I think one of the lessons from the rubber story was that the answer to the question, do you want to develop a rubber plantation, was often really sort of nuanced in terms of some farmers would have loved to have rubber plantations, especially if they had the land to do it on and the time to wait for the crop to mature. Rubber, it turned out, was not a great crop if you were super poor, but it didn't mean that poor people wouldn't very happily accept a rubber plantation if it was already producing. So it was rarely a question of we want this to go away. It was we want to be incorporated in ways that aren't harmful. So that the whole question of what the academics sometimes call adverse incorporation is just as important as the yes versus no question. And I think for renewable energy development, that's a major one. Certainly for renewables, I would expect to. I've gotten interested in the grid, the electricity grid for mainland Southeast Asia for other reasons, because of how it shapes land use. But I think I would love to chat more. And certainly given the certainly lots of vision and increasingly reality of transnational grid and power wheeling, there's a real real potential for Laos to become essentially what it already is for hydropower, but for solar, if hopefully solar replaces some of that green sheen that large-scale hydropower still unfortunately has, certainly in Southeast Asia and elsewhere. But that doesn't mean that there aren't attendant risks with that too.
Thanks, Mike. And that's really interesting too, what you said about the grid development. It made me think about, you know, the economic corridor, the road that you highlighted. And then of course, Jess's work on the rail, like this is yet another corridor in which we might see development of, say, renewables along.
Yeah, totally.
Thanks.
Anyone else want to jump in with a question? I'm happy to ask a few. I have so many written down in my notes. Mike, maybe I'll just throw out a few topics and choose whatever sound fun to talk about in the last couple minutes. But one is methods. It was just such a long-term project, and I was wondering how did you set out to make this a historical project in the first place, or was this really an ethnography, and kind of how you arrived at these methods to answer these questions. And then I was also, as you know, I've thought about past resettlement histories and how people kind of keep getting moved for different projects. And I think, I really find the argument of the uneven enclosure processes coming out of unevenness in citizenship really interesting. And I'm wondering how you think about that unevenness in citizenship today as people are being moved for other projects. And could you kind of use what you saw as, more or less political capital and apply that to, displacement that continues to happen today across Laos? And I will stop there, and I have more if we need them. Yeah.
The first one I did want to have, so part of the reason that I was interested in Laos was that the World Bank chose Laos as the place to do its first large dam financing after going through the World Commission on Dams process in the 90s. So that sort of made Laos a globally interesting case about the World Bank and hydropower development. But I also wanted to work somewhere that the US had a history. And so Laos was, say, a better choice for me than somewhere like India, say. There's a lot of the planet that, for better or worse, I could have gone to where the US has some kind of direct history as a quasi-imperial power. And so Laos ticked that off as well. So I did have some sense that I wanted to look at the historical dimensions of this. I did not plan to study the Northwest. I was initially, like I said, I was looking at Central Laos and the Vietnamese border. I was not really planning to study China. That was all serendipitous as a result of where I followed my informants while I was waiting for permission. And that ended up just being the story of where development was. And I think I got lucky in that sense. And it was there, the ability to connect the sort of China development story to the US legacy story was something that I glimpsed while I was in the field through little snippets that when people would mention, oh, they were resettled because they were seen as a security risk. But I didn't really get too many details until I got back and was able to cross-reference some of the interview and ethnographic data that I had with some of the secondary literature that I had sort of read but hadn't really gone into before I went to the field. I think if you know the phrase methodological nationalism, this is getting to your second question. I think there's also a version of what I would call methodological legalism that is very convenient if you are a developer that simply asks, oh, do you have a land title to this land as somehow adequate to the question of, is this your property? Whereas it is absolutely not. And the first people who will tell you that are the people who run land administration development projects. This is not like critical academia. This is basic development professionals 101. But there's such a strong interest in you could say acknowledging prior land ownership or strong interest in making that as small as possible when you're also trying to develop a project, whether it's a road project or a rail project or an energy project or whatever. But ironically, some of the people who figured this stuff out a while ago were the mining companies, because they realized that if they get into a conflict with the community 5 years into a major mining development and it shuts them down, it's actually bad for their bottom line. And so it depends. You could say there's an interest in long-term operations there to get it right the first time. But I also, look just to your work on the rail and say, well, there's plenty that's getting swept under the rug, and that displaced communities are not about to start shutting down train stations. But I do wish that, I think this is more of an issue for financiers. And so I think it's worth looking up the chain at financing. And I think some of the work that Global Witness and colleagues have done, looking at trying to target the banks that finance Vietnamese rubber companies. The companies themselves are not very accountable, but they are accountable to the banks, who are themselves accountable to essentially public pressure in democracies. So the extent to which that approach of following the money can be used to sort of get the conversation about land ownership outside these narrow, very highly interested circles, the better. And so I think that just trying to complexify property and have it move beyond the legal ownership, especially in contexts where the legal ownership is changing, both by the ongoing rolling out of titles, but also the recalibration of law to those titles themselves.
Thanks for that, Mike. It looks like Juliet has a question on weak governance and corruption. We can go to that, or is there anyone else in the audience who would like to jump in our last 5 minutes? Juliet, you want to take the last question?
Yeah.
Oh, wait.
Let's have
Please.
Hello, everyone. Thank you for your presentation. I'm a PhD student supervised by Carrie Sens at Global Development Institute. My research is about Laos wildlife conservation in Laos. But I have questions about migrations. How do you think about the migration group? Do you think migration group impact the land grab and agriculture development in northern Laos? Because I know there are a lot of migration group who lived in North Laos and run some companies in the areas. So how do you think about that?
Can you say more about what you mean by the migration group? I'm not following.
Because I think I know migration group plan key role in the areas. They run rubber companies, run plantations. But I noticed you just mentioned the political elements in the area. How do you think about the group?
I'm not understanding your question. I'm sorry.
Minority groups?
Migration group from China, Chinese migration group.
Chinese migrants.
Okay.
Themselves, I think, right?
Jess, sorry, I was talking over you. What did you say?
Oh, no, yeah, I think the companies themselves and the Chinese migrants with the companies.
Got it.
Yeah.
Got it. Okay, great question. So major caveat in that most of my fieldwork is pretty old right now. So I can't speak to the last 5 years, really. It's 4 years plus since I did even my follow-up work in July 2018. And when I was doing that follow-up work, I was not spending the time like I had spent a decade earlier in terms of looking at who was actually doing the labor. Back when I was doing the research, there was a lot of worry from both Lao people and especially Western development professionals who were, sort of constantly afraid of anything Chinese, who were doing the calculations of, okay, we're going to have X number of hectares of rubber that are planted and Y numbers of labor demand for tapping this rubber. and Y is greater than the number of labor units who are presently living in northern Laos. So these projects are going to have to import their labor. What I saw when I was studying the projects in terms of the ethnicity of who was actually doing the work was that when I went back in 2018, there was a huge amount of exclusion. This is the opening sketch for chapter 1 in the book, of the local communities from doing the labor of rubber tapping. But the laborers who had been brought in as migrant laborers were Lao. They were from Pongsali and they were from neighboring districts. So in this sense, there is increasingly mobile and migrant labor that in classic, it's a sort of a classic tactic from plantation and mining schemes. You don't want to use local labor because local labor is capable of organizing. Migrant labor is always more vulnerable. So I have seen a little bit of this in Laos, but it was Lao labor. The place where Chinese labor was involved was super interesting. It was essentially at the managerial level between the highly skilled labor, of whom there were maybe 1 or 2, maybe 3 per company. So not the hordes of migrant laborers that the Western development professionals especially were afraid of, but typically they were Lu or Dai, so essentially bi and tricultural people from the borderlands of Sichuan Bana, people who had worked in the Chinese rubber sector, but who were also able to communicate with Lao people and often with some of the upland ethnic minority groups because they spoke a third language as well, and were able to do some of that brokering between the technical dimensions of rubber planting and tapping and weeding and clearing and pesticide application, and the brute force labor of the people who are actually being paid the piecework. So that's what I was seeing. I was seeing a sort of a very niche role for Chinese labor rather than large scale migration. But again, I would love to hear more. There's been some, having, from what I've heard, little to do with Laos, lots of stories, especially from the Northwest, about migration and trafficking schemes and scams and all kinds of terrifying stuff. But I have not heard that come up in the context of rubber yet.
Okay, thank you.
Yeah.
I think because China reopened the borders, so I think Chinese migrants will significant impact northern Laos next few months.
Sure. Well, Danielle Tan has written a little bit about this. She's focused mostly on urban traders. And in that sense, there's a long history of Chinese migrants to Laos running urban trade in the provincial and to a lesser extent district capitals in northern Laos. So it's a presence that has been there for a while, but yeah, I wouldn't be surprised if it expands too.
Thank you.
Yeah.
Thanks. I agree. And everyone keeps saying to me, the train is just going to change how much tourism and labor come from China. So that is also something to watch. But we are at time. Juliet, maybe we can take your question offline at some point, but thanks for that one. As I mentioned earlier, check out the open access book and the conversation in Global China Pulse that Mike and Juliet did. And thank you both so much for the fascinating discussion and taking time to share your time and experience. And thanks everyone else who joined. Take care.
Thanks again for everybody for coming and for the comments and the introduction. It's lovely to be able to present this to y'all.